Hello, everyone, and welcome to the RV show. My name is Vinay.
And my name is Rohan. This year, we've finished many podcasts and we've seen a large improvement in not only the quality, but also the quantity of stories that we're presenting. And we thought that rather than presenting a new story this episode and this podcast, while there is a lot going on right now in the world, we thought it's best that we take some time to actually reflect on what we've done in the past. And um, Vinay, I think it was a great idea to kind of talk with you about kind of the improvements we've made and like how COVID has affected our life.
Mhm.
So I guess just to ask you some like general questions about our podcast and how you feel about how it's gone. What do you think you've gained from these podcasts that we've done? And in other words, like what have you learned living through history and kind of researching these projects that we've done? And how do you think our conversations have shifted over time?
Well, in terms of our conversation skills, I think there have been many problems when recording. At the start, I had a really bad microphone, and then we've been having to adjust the volume to make sure everything is right. We've had to speak faster because we were speaking too slowly. But I think overall, we've made a lot of progress in our podcast recording skills. And as for what I've gained, I think that this has been great opportunity for me to actually make sure I'm keeping tabs on the most important news. Because at times during the past, when I've been really busy in schoolwork, I've not had as much of an eye towards the current news. So I think having this podcast each almost every week this whole school year or every other week, I think it's been a really good way for me to make sure that I'm in the loop of the most important things going on in the world at that time.
Yeah, definitely. And I kind of have like the same sentiment about this question. I think really doing these podcasts has helped me stay engaged with the news and kind of the major stories. And I think there has been a pretty big shift in the way our conversations have gone in general. As I think kind of at the start, we were focused a little bit more on US politics, things like the presidential debates, and like the validity of polls and election results. And then kind of over time, we shifted to a more COVID-19 focus, looking at vaccines and global progress. Ultimately, last week, our episode was about COVID in India and the crisis that's going on there. So I really think we've seen kind of a shift in the sense that we've not only focused on domestic issues, but we've really focused on national issues as well.
Yeah, for sure.
So I guess to get a bit more like personal about your life, like what were some of the things that happened in your life pretty much in the past 14 months? Like how did you think your daily life has changed and how have your emotions changed at various points?
Well, I think one thing is I haven't had many significant events other than school. I've been mainly focusing on school and working from at school. Going to online school is obviously quite challenging. So I think in the middle of the year, I was getting quite burnt out with all the work that we did. But luckily, we had all of those breaks in between. And then also earlier in 2020, the end of 2020, what happened is my grandfather died. So I think that was one place where my emotions went really, really low. But I think at the same time, I've been able to have an escape almost in watching some cricket. And I think that that's really helped me stay emotionally balanced throughout this whole time.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm sorry to hear about your grandfather. I think really, especially in my friend group, we have seen a lot of deaths impacting the lives of my friends. And luckily, it hasn't impacted me personally. But I do think the COVID-19 pandemic has drastically changed our daily lives and the schedule. I mean, I'm
Mhm.
no longer waking up at 6 a.m. for school anymore. I'm only waking up at 8 right before school starts. And unfortunately, I am sleeping a lot later with the increased workload, like you talked about. And student burnout has become a very big problem, especially in Washington State. So I definitely do think there's been a big shift in emotions and the way people are feeling kind of over time. So I guess looking at a more broad sense of the pandemic and kind of your views within our podcast, how do you think the pandemic has shaped you as a person and your view of the world, specifically in relation to how you kind of perceive current events and evaluate them? What new skills or habits or attitudes do you want to like carry with you from this time period that you've developed?
Well, I think one thing is that I've learned not to be too reactionary, especially with Trump and Biden both handling the coronavirus very differently, and more personally looking at Indian politicians handling COVID, especially at the time when the cases were relatively low compared to the rest of the world. I feel like the COVID pandemic has really shaped how I'm looking at things holistically and how I'm making sure to make judgments after a large period of time. Like, for example, in terms of the politicians in India, I thought, oh, they're doing a fine job just because the COVID pandemic wasn't that rampant in India. But then I realized how lenient and how not seriously they are actually taking the pandemic once I realized exactly how they weren't quite handling the pandemic at the best in the best way.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the idea of not being too reactionary is a very good measure to live by and something that I definitely would take out of the pandemic. I definitely have seen that because initially what we see is like there's a lot of injustices happening in the world that we need to react to. Things like the BLM protests were happening even during COVID. But I think in regards to government policies, we need to realize that obviously the government is slow and it does take a while, and their lives are impacted by COVID too. And we just need to understand, um, like, we need to understand the circumstances that others are in right now. I think in regard to this question about like how COVID has shaped me as a person, I think it's actually forced me to develop better time management because I think what I ended up realizing is at the beginning of the pandemic, I had a lot of free time, but then as it kind of kept going on and we hit a new school year, I realized I started to get more busy, and I need to balance my time throughout the day and making sure I wasn't stuck on my computer the entire day. And I think when we were recording our podcast, I think it was important for us to realize that a lot of the stories that we talked about are pretty important things that are affecting the daily lives of other people as well. Um, so I guess I just want to do a quick reflection of some more individual stories that we've talked about this year. So I guess, Vinay, do you have any like standout podcasts or stories that um, you think really helped you in like understanding current events this year?
Well, I think just following the vice presidential and presidential debate at the start of the year was really influential because in the past, the way I usually approach elections is I'd watch the last presidential debate, then look at a couple of polls, and then I'd say, okay, this is what's going to happen. But I think actually having to follow the vice presidential debate in a good way forced me to actually understand everything that was happening, and it gave me a better understanding of the campaigns that each candidate was running. And then an additional one that really helped me was looking at the validity of polls and the current polls, because I personally didn't really know much about polling before that time. But after doing that podcast specifically, I actually chose to do the validity of polls as my research paper topic for English class. So I think that was another episode that really impacted me. And finally, I think just the one that we did last week about COVID in India, because that's something that really hits home for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those are probably three great podcasts that we've done. First, like highlight the presidential elections and the vice presidential debates and stuff like that. I think it was really interesting because I don't think I've ever paid this much attention to an election. I think it's the podcast is the only reason why I was actually able to analyze the election from both viewpoints and understand certain policies. But I've never watched the presidential debates in full, and this is the first year I've done that. So I think that's something that's really beneficial, and it's helped me become a more politically informed person. I think one other podcast that was pretty important was the social media regulation podcast. And I think the reason why that was so important is because we saw that that was one of the most polarizing issues that we've talked about this entire year. And I think there's things like the Capitol riots that are pretty big issues, but obviously things like vaccine distribution and vaccine progress aren't as like politically disputed as things like social media regulation, where you saw a lot of Republican social media sites kind of getting thrown off like Democrat based, or I guess like a lot of Democrat based social media sites. And I think that story was definitely one of the more controversial ones that we talked about this year. So I guess one more question that I would have about the progress that we've made this year is there anything that you think you're going to specifically continue that you started specifically due to our podcast? And I think that's in regards to um, how are you going to be looking at the news once we're done with the school year? Or do you want to keep doing podcasts, or are you going to start a new project, or how do you think you're really going to continue this kind of activism that we've started?
Well, I think one thing for sure is that I'll pay more attention to the news even when I'm busy, because I think I've realized the importance of actually following the news. Like there were so many different important events that happened, and there's so many different controversial things that we covered, such as social media regulation. In the past, I don't think I would have even looked at it, but with this podcast, I think I became more focused into a really politically dividing topic, and I think I was really able to connect more with what's happening in the world and kind of what each side of the political spectrum thinks. And I think that it was really important to do that because obviously when I turn 18, which is just in 2 years, I'll be voting in the next presidential election. So I think understanding kind of like the two sides of people and actually following the presidential debates the year that, I mean, the cycle before I actually vote, I think that was really helpful towards me.
Yeah, I definitely. I think one thing is I'd love to continue doing podcasts like these, whether it's just for my personal recording and just to listen for myself, or whether to actually post it on various platforms like we have been doing with YouTube. I think it's just helped me really stay involved with the news. But I think one other thing that I'm really going to take out of this, and it specifically came from our podcast about the Equality Act, is the importance of legislative change and how really your legislators and representatives in government can make a big difference. And I think even lobbying on the state level and kind of getting involved with civic activist organizations is something that's really important that I think we both can take away from the podcast that we've done. Just the importance of creating laws that are just equitable and really helpful for society.
Yeah, I completely agree. So now we can move on to the W segment. So since this is a cumulative episode, what we have done is we've selected 5 of our favorite stories. And Rohan, I'll ask you how you feel about each individual story. Then at the end of all of this, I'll ask for your favorite. So the first story is the story in which people in a certain Taiwanese town were changing their name to include salmon in it so that they could get free sushi. I think this may have been the most funny story of the year. So how did you feel about it, Rohan?
Yeah, well, I remember when we were recording this, we could barely stop laughing. I think it was just so funny the different names that people came up with and the different variations that they had just to get some free sushi. And it's just pretty cool to see that, like, honestly, there can be big community movements like those for things that are so trivial as getting free food. And it was just such a funny story.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think one of the most funny parts about it was that there's like a law on how many times you're allowed to change your name, and
Right.
people are obviously taking advantage of those laws.
It also kind of like provides a bright spot because I know we haven't had a segment about specifically what's going on in Taiwan and how dangerous it is to be in Taiwan, but it's a very serious place right now, especially with conflicts related to the US and China. So it's kind of like a bright spot in the region.
Yeah, I completely agree. So while this previous story that we just talked about was more positive, the next story that I'll talk about was a bit more saddening, as we learned about a man who lost his Bitcoin password. And to remind you, he had $220 million worth of Bitcoin in that account. For me personally, this was a great reminder about how important it is to remember and track your password. Looking back on the story, what was your takeaways from it, Rohan?
Yeah, well, I think this year we did a lot of stories related to money because I think there are a lot of really good stories about lottery tickets that we've done. And I know last week we did an episode about a kid who went on a shopping spree on Amazon for a SpongeBob popsicle. So I think there were a lot of things related to money. And this by far was the standout that we really could brainstorm today because I think it's just such a large sum of money that this guy lost and locked away forever due to um, like forgetting his password. And so I think it's pretty important that we realize, like you said, the importance of remembering your passwords and setting good passwords that you're able to recover, because I would get really mad if I lost that much money.
Yeah, for sure. And this is a reminder to all our listeners that even though it should be an easy to remember password for you personally, it should also be a safe password so that hackers can't get into your important accounts. So one of my personal favorite stories was the two men that robbed convenience stores while wearing watermelon rinds as disguises. This was a ridiculously innovative thing to do. And I personally was quite impressed by these two, even though I know what they did was obviously wrong. So what are you feeling about this story right now?
This story almost rivals the Taiwan story, and how funny it was and how hilarious it was. And I remember when we were actually doing research looking for the W segment stories, I just couldn't stop laughing at this one either. It was just so funny because you have two people who are like supposed to be like serious robbers, and they might be coming in with actual like armed weapons, and they're wearing watermelon rinds on their head, and it's just so funny. Like that's something I would do as a kid when my like after my mom uses it up cutting watermelons. And it's just like, I guess, brilliance in their disguises, because I guess one of them got away and they really were able to get away with it. So
Yeah, that was, um, I also agree with you. That was probably rivaling the first story in terms of how funny it was. So another pretty funny story that we have from this year was the Trump wax figure that got so beaten up that was not presentable in the display anymore. Now, it is also important to notice that all the presidents, not all, but most of the presidents in the past have been similarly punched and beaten down. And for me, this was a really weird story to analyze. How do you feel like you analyze that story?
yeah, well, I think it was really interesting when we were analyzing it, because at first we wanted to think of it as like kind of like a serious thing. We see a lot of people are um, resulting to a bit of violence in response to the president, which it might have been angering, yes, but there might be other solutions. But then I think once we kind of got into the reading the article, what we saw was this is actually just a presidential tradition, and in this town they were consistently doing it with almost every president. They were punching in the wax figures. And it kind of showed the importance of creating some sort of traditions in your community, and coming together, whether regardless of political parties, regardless of if the president is Democrat or Republican, they were still punching in the face. And so I think we kind of figured that out.
Yeah, for sure. I think it kind of showed that no matter if the your president is Democratic or Republican, I don't think anyone is fully satisfied with any president. And it's important to remember that all of our leaders are not perfect. And I think this was quite a
Absolutely.
funny way to kind of showcase that anger at them not being perfect.
Right.
So finally, we have the alarming news where ice cream in Northeast China tested positive for COVID-19 in January of this year. This was quite a shocking one for me. How do you remember it?
Yeah, I found this story to be really interesting, because I think this was back when COVID was really spreading, and um, we were kind of interested in seeing how COVID can get into even things like the food we were eating, and seeing it spread to ice cream was just such a unique situation that we've never seen before. So I think that was such a cool story to analyze and a cool story to research.
Yeah, for sure. It was very cool, but also very alarming for me because
Right,
I
right.
personally was kind of shocked that it could even come in our food when at the right temperature. So now we have completed reviewing the five stories that we selected. So Rohan, which one was your favorite?
Well, this is a really close one between the sushi one in Taiwan and the two men robbing the store with the watermelon rinds on their heads. But I think the one that has to edge it out is the Taiwan story, where people were changing their names to salmon for free sushi. Because I just think the names were just so ridiculous. Like imagine changing your name to Explosive Good Looking Salmon, or some long names like Chen Loves Taiwan, Abalone, Tuna, Salmon, Snook. Like, it's just such a long name and so ridiculous, and it's such a cool thing to see.
Yeah, I think that was also up there for me. But personally, the Trump wax figure that got beaten up, that was my favorite because I really found it really interesting how a wax figure was repeatedly punched over and over again.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this year we've had a great year looking at these W segment stories. And I think the reason why we started in the first place is because we kind of realized that we are talking a lot about very serious stories, and we kind of wanted to add some fun to the podcast. So I definitely think it was a great idea to add this W segment, and it was just such a fun thing to do, Vinay, along with the the more serious political research that we were doing before.
Yeah,
So
for sure.
I guess that wraps it up for this podcast, and I guess we'll see if this continues in the future. But this is definitely the end for this pretty much school year, and I guess thank you, Vinay, for recording a great so far. This would be the 12th podcast. We think we've definitely made a lot of progress talking about a bunch of different stories, whether it's serious or funny, whether it impacts our lives or impacts people around the world. And I definitely think we've seen a lot of progress throughout the couple months that we were doing this.
Yeah, for sure. This has been a really informative experience, and I've really enjoyed doing this, documenting history along with you. That
Absolutely.
wraps it up. Goodbye.
Thank you so much.
What's up, everyone? Vinay here from the RV Show. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Make sure you like the video and subscribe to stay updated on all of our new content. Also, if you are looking for past episodes, check out our YouTube playlist.